When people talk about loving a narcissist, they often describe the obvious damage: broken trust, emotional exhaustion, the eventual collapse of the relationship. What's discussed far less is the quiet internal shift that happens long before anything visibly breaks. Your identity doesn't shatter all at once. It slowly reorganizes itself around survival. At the beginning, you don't notice it. You think you're just being understanding, flexible, compassionate. You tell yourself that relationships require compromise, that love means patience. But over time, something subtle happens. You start paying more attention to their moods than your own needs. You learn which version of yourself keeps the peace, which tone avoids criticism, which opinions are safest to express. Without realizing it, you're no longer asking, "What do I feel?" You're asking, "What will keep this connection intact?" From a psychological perspective, this is not weakness, it's adaptation. As Dr. Gabor Maté often reminds us, the human nervous system is wired first for attachment, not authenticity. When attachment feels threatened, especially by someone who withholds love or approval, the psyche makes a trade. It sacrifices parts of the self in order to preserve connection. This is especially true for people who learned early in life that love was conditional, inconsistent, or tied to performance. So your identity begins to reorganize itself around cues of safety and danger. You become skilled at reading the room. You anticipate reactions. You edit your emotions in real time. Anger feels dangerous, so you suppress it. Sadness feels inconvenient, so you minimize it. Joy feels risky because it can provoke envy or dismissal. What remains is a carefully curated version of yourself. Functional, agreeable, emotionally muted. Philosophically, this is where the deepest damage occurs. Not because you're being controlled, but because you are slowly disappearing from your own inner life. You begin to experience yourself not as a source of truth, but as a variable to be adjusted. Your worth becomes relational rather than intrinsic. You feel real when you're approved of, invisible when you're not. Over time, this survival-based identity feels normal. In fact, it can feel responsible, mature, even loving. You may pride yourself on being the stable one, the understanding one, the person who doesn't overreact. But inside, there's often a quiet grief, a sense that something essential has been set aside, though you can't quite name what it is. What's important to understand is that this rewiring doesn't stop when the relationship ends. The body and mind don't immediately recognize safety just because the narcissist is gone. The habits of self-monitoring remain. You may enter new relationships still scanning for disapproval, still adjusting yourself preemptively. Even alone, you might struggle to know what you actually want because wanting itself once felt dangerous. This is why many survivors say, "I don't feel like myself anymore." It's not that the self is gone. It's that it learned to hide. And hiding over time becomes a form of identity. From a trauma-informed lens, healing doesn't begin with blaming yourself for losing your sense of self. It begins with understanding why you had to. That version of you, the one who adapted, who stayed quiet, who endured, was intelligent. It was trying to keep you connected, safe, and emotionally alive under impossible conditions. Compassion, not criticism, is the doorway back. Reclaiming identity after loving a narcissist is not about becoming who you were before. That person existed before this knowledge, before this clarity. The task now is deeper. It's about learning to tolerate authenticity again, to feel without immediately self-correcting, to notice your body's responses without dismissing them, to ask yourself simple but radical questions. What do I feel right now? What do I need? What do I believe, even if no one agrees? This process can feel unsettling because survival identities are familiar. Authenticity is uncertain. It doesn't guarantee approval, but it does restore integrity. Slowly, as safety returns to the nervous system, the self no longer has to fragment to belong. You discover that you can be connected without being erased. And perhaps that is the lasting transformation. Loving a narcissist changes you forever, not because it destroys you, but because it forces a reckoning with who you become when love requires self-abandonment and who you can become when it doesn't. The quiet victory is this: the moment you stop surviving and start returning to yourself. Another way loving a narcissist changes you forever is through the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of your trust in your own reality. This is not simply about being lied to or manipulated in obvious ways. It's about something far more destabilizing. The gradual breakdown of your inner compass. The voice inside you that once said, "This doesn't feel right," and trusted itself enough to stop there. In the beginning, you might notice small inconsistencies. A comment that feels cutting but is framed as a joke. A promise that's forgotten, then denied. An emotional reaction you're told is too much, too sensitive, or imagined. At first, you push back internally. You feel confused, unsettled. But because the narcissist often speaks with confidence and certainty, you start to doubt yourself rather than the relationship. After all, they seem so sure, and certainty is persuasive. From a psychological standpoint, this is where gaslighting becomes especially damaging, not as a tactic, but as an environment. You're not just being told that a specific event didn't happen. You're being taught over time that your perceptions are unreliable, that your emotional responses are distortions, that your memory is flawed. And when this happens repeatedly in an attachment relationship, the mind adapts in a very specific way. It learns to defer. Instead of asking, "What did I experience?" you begin asking, "What is the correct version of events?" And the answer to that question increasingly comes from outside of you. This is profoundly disorienting because the sense of self is built on continuity, on trusting that your internal experience has coherence and meaning. When that trust is undermined, the self becomes unstable. Dr. Gabor Maté often speaks about how trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside us as a result of what happens. In this case, what happens inside is a rupture in epistemic trust, the trust in your own knowing. You begin to second-guess even basic emotional signals. Am I really hurt, or am I overreacting? Am I unhappy or just ungrateful? Am I remembering this accurately or rewriting history? Philosophically, this kind of doubt cuts deep. It separates you from your lived experience and places authority in someone else's narrative. Over time, reality itself becomes negotiable. And when reality is negotiable, power shifts. The person who defines what's real controls the emotional terrain of the relationship. What's particularly insidious is that this erosion often masquerades as self-improvement. You may tell yourself you're becoming more self-aware, more reflective, more open to feedback. You pride yourself on checking your ego, on not being reactive. But beneath that apparent growth is a quiet self-betrayal. You're not expanding your awareness, you're shrinking your trust. The nervous system plays a crucial role here. Chronic invalidation creates a state of hypervigilance mixed with confusion. Your body senses danger, but your mind is told there is none. This mismatch generates anxiety, self-doubt, and often a feeling of being unmoored. You may find yourself replaying conversations obsessively, searching for clarity that never comes. Not because you're incapable of understanding, but because the ground keeps shifting. Even after the relationship ends, this pattern often remains. You may struggle to make decisions without external reassurance. You may distrust your instincts even when they're accurate. You may feel uneasy urging boundaries, because boundaries require confidence in your own perception of harm. If you're not sure something is real, how can you justify protecting yourself from it? Healing this wound is not about becoming more skeptical of others. It's about rebuilding trust inward. That begins gently, by noticing what your body tells you before your mind intervenes, by allowing emotions to exist without immediately evaluating whether they're justified, by remembering that feelings are not arguments to be won, they are signals to be listened to. This is slow work, because you're undoing a pattern that once kept you connected, but each time you choose to believe your own experience, even tentatively, you reclaim a piece of your authority. You start to recognize that clarity doesn't come from debating reality with someone else. It comes from standing inside your own experience and allowing it to be valid. Loving a narcissist changes you forever because it teaches you what it feels like to lose your footing in your own mind, and eventually, what it takes to stand there again. The turning point is simple and profound. The moment you stop asking permission to trust yourself. A deeper and often unspoken way loving a narcissist changes you forever is how it reshapes your relationship with love itself. Not just with that person, but with the very idea of intimacy, safety, and emotional closeness. After such a relationship, love no longer feels simple or nourishing. It feels conditional, earned, fragile. And that shift leaves a long psychological echo. When you first enter a relationship with a narcissist, love is often intense, focused, intoxicating. You are seen, mirrored, ideally. There is a sense of being chosen in a way that feels almost fated. For many people, this activates something very old, a longing to finally be enough, to finally be special, to finally be securely held. And because that initial connection feels so powerful, your nervous system learns a dangerous association. Intensity equals love. As time goes on, that intensity becomes unpredictable. Warmth alternates with withdrawal. Affection is followed by criticism. Connection is offered, then withheld. From a psychological perspective, this creates a trauma bond, but beyond the terminology, what it really does is train your emotional system to work for love rather than receive it. Love becomes something you chase, maintain, manage, and repair, often at the expense of your own needs. Dr. Gabor Maté often emphasizes that when attachment is threatened, authenticity is sacrificed. In these relationships, that sacrifice becomes chronic. You learn to suppress parts of yourself that disrupt harmony. You soften your truth. You delay your needs. You become highly attuned to the emotional weather of the other person because attunement feels like survival. Over time, this doesn't just affect the relationship. It reshapes your identity. Philosophically, this is where love becomes confused with self-abandonment. You begin to believe, often unconsciously, that closeness requires effort, vigilance, and emotional flexibility that bends only one way. You may even come to see emotional pain as proof of depth. After all, if love didn't hurt, would it feel real? This belief doesn't arise from weakness. It arises from adaptation. The tragedy is that this adaptation follows you. In future relationships, you may feel restless with stability. Calm can feel suspicious. Consistency may register as boredom. When someone shows up emotionally available and grounded, part of you may not recognize it as love because it doesn't activate the familiar highs and lows your nervous system learned to associate with connection. At the same time, you may carry a quiet fear of being fully seen. Vulnerability no longer feels safe, it feels risky. You've learned that openness can be used against you, that your needs can become liabilities. So you may keep parts of yourself hidden not because you want to, but because your body remembers what happened the last time you didn't. This is one of the most lasting impacts. Love becomes something you approach cautiously, strategically, rather than something you rest inside. Even when you long for closeness, you may feel exhausted by the idea of it. Intimacy now seems like work, negotiation, emotional labor, and you may wonder, quietly, why love feels so hard when it's supposed to be healing. What's important to understand is that none of this means you are broken. It means your system learned under pressure. The human psyche is remarkably adaptive. When love is paired with inconsistency, the mind doesn't say, "This is unsafe." It says, "What must I do to keep this?" And that question reshapes behavior, beliefs, and expectations in profound ways. Healing here requires a re-education of love at the nervous system level, not through force or positive thinking, but through new experiences of connection that are slow, reciprocal, and emotionally honest. It involves noticing when you feel compelled to earn affection and gently asking yourself why love would need to be earned at all. It means allowing discomfort when things are calm, rather than mistaking calm for absence. There's also grief in this process. Grief for the innocence you once had about love. Grief for the version of yourself who believed connection didn't have to cost so much. That grief deserves space, because it marks a loss that is real, but it also marks a turning point. When you begin to disentangle love from suffering, something fundamental shifts. You start to recognize that love does not require you to disappear, that connection does not demand self-erasure, that safety is not boring, it is regulating. Slowly, love stops feeling like something you survive and starts feeling like something that supports your becoming. Loving a narcissist changes you forever because it teaches you how deeply love can wound, but also how deeply it can be redefined. And the moment you realize that love should not cost you yourself, you begin to choose differently. Another way loving a narcissist changes you forever is how it alters your relationship with your own inner voice. Not just your confidence, but your capacity to trust what you feel, sense, and know. This is one of the quietest injuries, and also one of the most profound. In the beginning, you likely trusted yourself. You noticed discomfort and named it. You felt confusion and tried to understand it. But in a narcissistic dynamic, your inner signals are slowly, repeatedly challenged. When you express hurt, you're told you're too sensitive. When something feels wrong, you're accused of overthinking. When you remember events clearly, you're contradicted with absolute certainty. Over time, something subtle happens. You stop believing yourself. From a psychological perspective, this isn't just manipulation, it's a disruption of self-trust. The mind relies on feedback to stay oriented in reality. When the person closest to you consistently denies your experience, your nervous system enters a state of disorientation. You begin to question not just what happened, but whether you have the right to feel what you feel. Dr. Gabor Maté often speaks about how trauma disconnects us from ourselves. This is a clear example. To maintain attachment, especially when it feels essential for emotional survival, you learn to override your own perceptions. You silence your intuition in order to preserve the relationship. And that silencing doesn't stay confined to that one connection. It becomes a pattern. After loving a narcissist, many people describe feeling unsure, even in neutral situations. Making decisions becomes difficult. You second-guess your reactions. You ask others to validate what you already know, because your inner authority has been eroded. This isn't indecisiveness. By nature, it's learned self-doubt. Philosophically, this is the cost of being taught that your reality is negotiable. When truth becomes something external, something granted or denied by another person, you lose access to your own compass. And without a compass, even safe ground can feel unstable. What's especially painful is that this loss of self-trust often comes wrapped in shame. You may criticize yourself for allowing it, for not leaving sooner, for missing red flags. But this misses the deeper truth. You adapted to preserve connection. The human psyche will always choose attachment over accuracy when attachment feels necessary. This is not a flaw, it's biology. The narcissistic dynamic trains you to scan outward instead of inward. You become hyper-focused on tone shifts, moods, subtle changes in behavior. Your attention turns away from your body, your feelings, your instincts. And when that happens for long enough, your inner world begins to feel distant, even inaccessible. After the relationship ends, this can be deeply unsettling. You may finally be free, yet feel oddly ungrounded. Without the constant emotional reference point of the narcissist, you were left alone with a self you no longer fully recognize or trust. Silence can feel louder than conflict ever was. Healing here is not about rebuilding confidence in a motivational sense. It's about rebuilding relationship with your own experience. It starts small, noticing what your body feels like in certain situations, paying attention to subtle signals of comfort or discomfort without immediately dismissing them, allowing your emotions to exist without needing justification. This process can feel uncomfortable because trusting yourself again requires tolerating uncertainty. There is no external authority to confirm you're right. You have to sit with your own knowing, even when it feels fragile. But each time you honor your inner response instead of overriding it, something strengthens. There is also grief in recognizing how often you were taught to betray yourself, how many moments you swallowed words, ignored instincts, minimized pain. That grief is not self-pity. It's self-recognition. It's the acknowledgement that something essential was compromised in the name of love. Over time, as self-trust returns, something powerful happens. You stop needing to explain your feelings so thoroughly. You stop arguing yourself out of discomfort. You begin to act earlier instead of waiting until pain becomes unbearable, and relationships begin to change, not because others are different, but because you are no longer negotiating against your own reality. This doesn't make you rigid or defensive. In fact, it makes you more open. When you trust yourself, you don't need to control others. You don't need constant reassurance. You can be present without losing yourself. Loving a narcissist changes you forever because it teaches you what it feels like to live without self-trust. But reclaiming that trust teaches you something even more important, that your inner voice was never wrong, it was just unheard. Another lasting way loving a narcissist changes you forever is how it reshapes your understanding of love itself, not in an abstract romantic sense, but in the deepest emotional wiring of how closeness, safety, and connection are experienced in your body. In the beginning, what you likely felt wasn't confusion, it was intensity. The bond formed quickly, powerfully, often with a sense of recognition that felt almost spiritual. You may have felt seen in a way you hadn't before, chosen, elevated. And because the early connection was so charged, your nervous system learned to associate intensity with intimacy. This is where the imprint begins. From a psychological standpoint, this is not coincidence. Narcissistic relationships often activate unresolved attachment wounds. The highs feel euphoric because they temporarily soothe deep fears of abandonment or invisibility. The lows feel devastating. Because they reactivate those same fears. Over time, your system becomes conditioned. Love equals emotional volatility. Dr. Gabor Maté reminds us that trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside us as a result of what happens. What happens inside in these relationships is a distortion of safety. Calm starts to feel boring. Consistency feels suspicious. Kindness without cost feels unreal. Your body, accustomed to emotional turbulence, begins to interpret peace as absence. This is why many people leaving narcissistic relationships struggle in healthy ones. It's not that they don't want stability, it's that stability doesn't register as love at first. Without the push-pull dynamic, without the intermittent reinforcement, the nervous system doesn't receive the familiar chemical spikes it learned to associate with bonding. So the connection feels flat, even though it's safe. Philosophically, this raises a painful question. If love has always hurt, how do you recognize it when it doesn't? The answer is uncomfortable because it asks you to unlearn what once kept you emotionally alive. It requires a willingness to feel unfamiliar sensations and to stay present without the drama that once defined connection. There's often grief here too. Grief for the fantasy that love could heal wounds without confronting them. Grief for the belief that intensity meant depth. Letting go of these ideas can feel like losing romance itself. But what's actually being lost is not love. It's survival strategy disguised as passion. After loving a narcissist, many people find themselves unconsciously recreating familiar patterns, drawn to emotionally unavailable partners, confusing Jing with connection, feeling most alive when love is uncertain. This isn't because they enjoy suffering, it's because the nervous system seeks what it knows. Healing requires reframing love not as something that overwhelms you, but as something that holds you. This is a radical shift. It asks you to redefine attraction not by how strongly someone pulls you, but by how safe you feel being yourself around them. And safety at first can feel strangely quiet. There may also be a period where love feels unreachable altogether, where closeness triggers fear rather than desire. This too is part of the transformation. Your system is recalibrating, learning that connection does not have to come at the cost of self-abandonment. This phase isn't failure, it's integration. What changes forever is that you no longer idealize love as sacrifice. You begin to see how much pain was normalized in the name of devotion, how often endurance was mistaken for loyalty. And once you see this, it becomes impossible to unsee. You can no longer romanticize suffering without feeling the cost. This awareness doesn't make you cynical, it makes you discerning. You start asking different questions. Not how much do I feel, but how do I feel with them? Not can I save this relationship, but am I safe inside myself here? These questions mark a profound internal shift. Over time, love becomes less about chemistry and more about compatibility of nervous systems, less about proving worth and more about mutual presence. You begin to value people who don't hijack your emotions, who don't require you to shrink, explain, or perform to stay connected. And perhaps the most lasting change is this: stop confusing longing with love.